Welcome to Germany, a nation of poets and thinkers, warriors and dreamers. From the dense forests of ancient tribes to the mighty engines of modern industry, Germany's story is one of resilience, innovation, and transformation. Today, we explore the entire history of Germany, from its earliest roots to the powerful country it is today. Long before there was a Germany, the land was home to countless tribes, the Germanic peoples. Living among forests and rivers, they were fierce and independent, resisting Roman rule. Julius Caesar first encountered them in the 1st century BCE and called their land Germania. While Rome controlled parts of Western Europe, Germania remained unconquered, forming a borderland of freedom and defiance. These tribes, like the Saxons, Franks, and Goths, would later shape Europe's future. After the fall of Rome, a new power emerged, the Franks, led by Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. In the 8th century, he united much of Western Europe and was crowned emperor by the Pope in 800 CE. Charlemagne's empire became the foundation for what would later evolve into the Holy Roman Empire, with its heart in German-speaking lands. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't a single nation, but a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities ruled by princes and bishops. For nearly 1,000 years, it was the central power in Europe, home to mighty dynasties like the Habsburgs. Cities like Nuremberg, Cologne, and Frankfurt flourished as centers of art and trade. But the empire was fragile, constantly divided by politics, religion, and ambition. In the 16th century, a monk named Martin Luther changed everything. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, sparking the Protestant Reformation. This religious movement divided Europe between Catholics and Protestants. For decades, Germany became a battlefield, especially during the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, one of the deadliest conflicts in history. When peace finally came, the empire was shattered, leaving behind independent German states. By the 18th century, two great powers competed for control: Austria and Prussia. Under the leadership of Frederick the Great, Prussia rose to dominance with a strong army and efficient government. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, which reshaped Europe. After Napoleon's defeat, calls for German unity grew louder. Finally, in 1871, after victory in the Franco-Prussian War, Otto von Bismarck united the German states under Kaiser Wilhelm I. The German Empire was born, industrial, powerful, and ambitious. Germany's rapid rise led to tensions with other European powers, culminating in World War I, 1914 to 1918. After years of brutal fighting, Germany was defeated. The Treaty of Versailles forced it to pay heavy reparations and surrender territories. In the aftermath, Germany became a fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic, a time of both artistic brilliance and political chaos. In 1933, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party rose to power, promising to restore Germany's greatness. But instead, they plunged the world into darkness. Under Nazi rule, Germany invaded its neighbors, beginning World War II in 1939. The war devastated Europe, and the Holocaust took the lives of millions of innocent people. By 1945, Germany lay in ruins, divided and defeated once again. After the war, Germany was split into East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Germany, supported by the Allies. For decades, the Berlin Wall symbolized this division: communism versus democracy, East versus West. Then, in 1989, the wall fell. The following year, Germany was reunified, marking the birth of the modern nation we know today. Today, Germany stands as Europe's largest economy, a global leader in engineering, science, and culture. Cities like Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg blend medieval charm with modern innovation. Germany is known for its cars, festivals like Oktoberfest, and dedication to renewable energy and sustainability. It's a nation that faced its past and built a better future. From ancient tribes to modern technology, Germany's journey spans 2 millennia of change, struggle, and triumph. Its story reminds us that even through the darkest times, a nation can rebuild, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever.
The calm before the clash. Their weapons were extensions of their soul. A knight's sword was more than a blade. It was a symbol of divine justice, of chivalric order. Many gave their swords names: joyous, faithful, lion's bite. Before battle, it was common to bless the sword in holy water or lay it upon an altar overnight, as though sanctifying it for the blood to come. As the final night approached, the camp became a strange theater of human emotion. Some knights laughed too loudly around the fire, pretending bravery. Others sat alone, silent, staring into the flames. A few penned last letters to wives, to mothers, to unborn children, sealed with wax, handed to squires with quiet instructions: "If I fall, send this home." Many could not sleep. Those who tried often lay beneath the canvas of their tents, listening to the murmurs of men beyond, the rustle of banners, the stomp of hooves, the metallic whisper of blades being drawn and sheathed again and again, as though each man rehearsed the act of killing. Superstition ran deep in those hours. Some knights carried relics sewn into their tunics: a saint's bone, a cross, a lock of a loved one's hair. Others whispered charms to ward off evil spirits. And then there were those who kept nothing at all, believing fate to be unchangeable. The ground was cold, the air damp with dew. Horses shifted restlessly, sensing what their masters could not say aloud. For animals, war was confusion. For men, it was destiny. Squires worked through the night, tightening saddles, checking stirrups, laying out armor in careful order. First the linen shirt, then the padded gambeson, then the mail or plate, each layer heavy, each layer a burden, but to a knight it was a sacred uniform, a mark of his status, his oath, his belief in order amidst chaos. At the center of camp, the Lord's tent stood larger and brighter than the rest. Inside, maps were spread over tables, rough sketches of rivers, forests, hills. Captains spoke in hushed tones, tracing lines with gloved fingers. They argued over formations, over timing, over the ground itself. Every hill, every patch of mud could mean victory or defeat.
Outside, guards kept vigil. The night grew older. Owls called from the woods. Somewhere a squire sang softly, a song his mother once sang to him as a child. The words were lost to history, but the melody carried through the camp like a ghost. And then, as the moon began to dip, something remarkable happened, a kind of stillness. Not the silence of peace, but the hush before the storm. Knights, one by one, surrendered to exhaustion. Some slept sitting up, leaning against their shields. Others lay upon cloaks, using saddles as pillows. A few prayed until their eyes closed. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent witnesses to the dreams of men who would soon be dust. And in those dreams many saw home, fields of wheat, the laughter of family, the scent of summer rain. Some saw God. Others saw nothing but endless battle. At dawn, the horns would sound. But in this fragile moment, between sleep and death, between courage and fear, there was a deep humanity. The world of the night was not one of constant glory, as the poems would later claim. It was a world of doubt, of aching muscles, of prayers whispered into straw-filled ground. They were not machines of war, but men bound by duty, belief, and the quiet terror of what awaited them beyond sunrise. This was how knights prepared for war, not only with sword and shield, but with ritual, faith, and the fragile hope that they would live to see another dawn. Armor, horses, and rituals of readiness. When dawn approached, the chill of the medieval morning crept across the fields like a silent tide. The mist was pale and heavy, clinging to the tents and banners until every thread shimmered with dew. A low horn sounded, not yet the call to arms, but the soft summons of the squires, stirring their lords awake. The camp, still drowsy and half-dreaming, began to shift and stir. The world smelled of smoke, damp wool, and oiled steel. Inside his tent, a knight sat cross-legged on a rough wool blanket, his breath clouding faintly in the cool air. Before him lay the instruments of his trade, the tools that separated him from the common soldier. His armor gleamed dully in the half-light, each plate a story of labor and faith. The ritual of dressing for battle was as sacred as any prayer. First came the linen shirt, light and soft against the skin, meant to keep the metal from biting. Then the gambeson, a padded jacket of quilted layers, thick and weighty. It smelled faintly of salt and sweat,
proof that this man had worn it through many campaigns. Next, his squire, barely 15, eyes red from sleeplessness, helped him into his mail hauberk. The shirt of rings slithered like water over his shoulders. Each link had been forged and riveted by hand, thousands of tiny circles forming a flexible wall of steel.
It took strength to lift it, patience to maintain it, and courage to wear it. Over the mail came plate armor, the advancement of the new age. A breastplate shaped to deflect blows, spalders over the shoulders, greaves for the legs, gauntlets for the hands, polished until they caught the faint glow of the lantern. Each piece fastened with leather straps, tightened by the squire's trembling fingers. "Not too tight," the knight murmured, voice low, calm, the practiced tone of a man who had done this 100 times before. "If I cannot breathe, I cannot fight." The boy nodded, fumbling slightly, eyes wide with both pride and fear. Outside, the camp began to hum with life. Fires crackled anew. Bread was broken. Ale passed around, and armor clinked like wind chimes. The horses, the destriers, the war steeds of Europe, were being prepared. Massive animals, bred for strength rather than speed, their hooves churned the mud as they snorted and pawed at the ground. Their coats shone, brushed to a fine gloss, and their manes were braided with ribbons bearing the colors of their masters. Each horse wore barding, armor suited for its own body, quilted caparaçons or steel plates that glinted beneath the rising light. To a knight, his horse was not merely an animal. It was his partner in glory, his shield in battle, his very identity. Many knights would whisper to their mounts before the fight, quiet, secret words, as if sharing their last thoughts with an old friend. One might stroke the broad neck of his charger and murmur, "You and I, my friend, we have another dance to attend." Another might press his forehead to the animals and breathe, "Carry me through this one more time." There was tenderness in those moments, a bond forged not in peace, but in countless charges through mud, fire, and blood. Once dressed, the knight reached for his belt of arms, leather worn smooth by years of use. Upon it hung his sword, the heart of his identity. He drew it slowly, letting the blade catch the light of dawn. To most it was a weapon. To him, it was a covenant.
The sword had perhaps been blessed by a priest, kissed by a lady, or inherited from a father. It carried memory and meaning, symbols that transcended steel. Some knights would tap it gently against the cross-guard and whisper prayers. "By this cross I fight in faith. Let my hand not falter." Others remained silent, believing the sword itself knew its purpose. Next came the lance, long and slender, resting beside his tent. Its shaft was smooth, the tip glinting with cruel precision. The knight's banner, his pennon, was tied near the point, fluttering like a flame. When the battle began, that small piece of cloth would become a beacon, guiding his men and proclaiming who he was to friend and foe alike. The squires moved quickly, their tasks endless. One tightened straps, another fetched water for the horses, another gathered discarded pieces of mail and armor for repair. Their young hands bore the marks of labor, blisters, burns, and the faint stains of rust that never washed away. For them, this was their apprenticeship.
One day they too would bear the weight of steel. But for now they served, learning through exhaustion what it meant to be a knight. In the background, priests and monks walked through the camp, blessing men and banners. The scent of incense mingled with that of horses and iron. A few knights knelt, heads bowed as Latin prayers flowed over them like rain. Domine, dirige nos in pugna. Lord, guide us in battle. For all their earthly training, they believed victory was ultimately decided by heaven. As the light grew, the sky began to shift, a pale wash of gold over the gray horizon. The fog lifted, revealing lines of tents stretching across the valley. Flags and symbols fluttered in the cold wind: lions, eagles, fleur-de-lis, crosses. The knights began to assemble. Each stood beside his horse, surrounded by squires tightening straps and adjusting helmets. The air filled with the metallic symphony of preparation, the rhythmic clang of armor, the click of buckles, the low murmur of voices. A senior knight, his beard streaked with silver, walked through the ranks, inspecting his men. He paused beside each, offering brief words, reminders of formation, of courage, of discipline. But he knew what truly mattered could not be taught. Courage, once tested, either held or shattered.
Before the final preparations, a meal was shared, the last supper before battle. It was simple fare: bread torn by hand, cheese, smoked meat, watered wine. The knights ate standing or crouched near their fires. Some laughed, others were silent, chewing slowly, as if trying to delay the inevitable moment. Superstitions governed every bite. To drop your knife was bad luck. To spill wine was a sign of blood to come. And if a raven landed nearby, men would mutter prayers and avert their eyes. Some camps even had bards or heralds who sang softly, not songs of victory, but of remembrance. Stories of Roland at Roncevaux, of King Arthur and his knights, of saints who died with swords in hand. These tales were both comfort and warning, reminders of the fragile thread between glory and death. When the first rays of sun broke through the mist, the world seemed to ignite. Armor flashed like liquid fire, and the valley filled with movement. Banners lifting, horses stamping, commands echoing. The knight mounted his destrier, feeling the animal's strength surge beneath him. The saddle creaked, the reins were taut. The weight of armor pressed against his shoulders, but he sat tall, a living statue of iron and intent. Around him hundreds did the same. A forest of lances rose, sunlight caught on spearheads until the air seemed filled with stars. The air trembled with anticipation. Each knight took his place in the formation, banners grouped by lord, by family, by oath. They were not yet a storm, but the thunder was building. Then came the final ritual, one older than chivalry itself, the kiss of peace. Each knight turned to the man beside him and clasped forearms, a gesture of unity, of brotherhood. No words were needed, they all understood.
One by one, they lowered their visors. The world darkened to the narrow slit of their helmets. The sound of their own breathing filled the hollow space, slow, rhythmic, steady. In that enclosed silence, they ceased to be men and became something else entirely. The embodiment of order, of duty, of chivalric will.
And yet, beneath all the steel and ceremony, hearts still beat with human fear. Some whispered final prayers, others thought of home. A few simply stared ahead, ready for whatever awaited. The Lord of the host raised his sword high, the signal glinting in the rising sun. The banners lifted, the trumpets cried out, and the camp, once so full of quiet ritual, erupted into motion. The knights, their preparations complete, rode forward toward destiny, their armor gleaming, their faith unshaken, their dreams of honor rising with the dust of their horses' hooves. But behind the grandeur, behind the roar and thunder, lingered the memory of that morning, the tender work of the squires, the whispered prayers, the sacred dressing of armor. For all wars begin not with blood, but with preparation, the slow, solemn transformation of men into warriors. The training of the knight's mind, fear, faith, and discipline. War begins long before the first blade is drawn. For a knight, battle was not just a contest of strength, it was a trial of the spirit. To fight without fear was impossible, to master it was divine. The medieval knight lived in a world ruled by faith. Every act of his life, from birth to knighthood, was framed by ceremony, prayer, and the promise of salvation. He was told that his sword defended God's order, that his courage was holy, and that death in service could open heaven's gate. But even faith, strong as it was, could tremble before the sight of an approaching army. So knights learned to train the mind as rigorously as the body. Before campaigns began, lords and commanders gathered their men for what they called councils of courage. In a great tent or beneath the open sky, older knights spoke of honor, discipline, and composure. They reminded the younger ones that fear was natural, even noble. The coward feels nothing, an old commander might say, but a brave man feels fear and rides forward all the same. The younger knights listened in silence, eyes lowered, hands clenched around their swords. They had read of saints and heroes, of Roland's last stand, of Lancelot's perfect valor. Yet they knew that real war did not sing, it screamed. The smell of blood, the cries of horses, the weight of armor pressing down, these were truths no poem could teach. To prepare for such terror, knights trained themselves to face it piece by piece.
They practiced charging at solid walls of shields, their lances lowered, horses thundering, hearts pounding. They learned to endure the deafening noise of drums and horns, the sudden crash of men colliding. It was not courage they built, but habit, to move through fear by repetition until instinct replaced hesitation. They drilled for hours with their comrades, repeating formations, learning to trust the signal of a banner or the horn's call more than their own nerves.
A knight's mind had to obey before it questioned, for in the chaos of battle, thinking too long could mean death. Religion filled the spaces that discipline could not. Every knight carried the weight of faith differently. Some prayed daily, reciting the Pater Noster before sunrise. Others confessed before each battle, fearing not the sword, but eternal damnation. Many belonged to orders of chivalry, such as the Templars or Hospitallers, whose vows blurred the line between monk and warrior. For them, warfare was not only permitted, it was sanctified. To fight the enemies of Christ was, they believed, to serve heaven itself. Even secular knights adopted fragments of this piety. They believed angels rode beside them, saints watched over their swords, and God alone chose who lived or died. This conviction, real or imagined, gave them strength. For when you believe the outcome rests with God, fear becomes lighter to bear. But not all knights found comfort in prayer. Some doubted, quietly, secretly. They wondered if God truly favored one banner over another, if bloodshed could ever be righteous, if heaven heard the cries of the dying at all. These were dangerous thoughts, spoken only to trusted friends or confessors. Yet they were human thoughts, proof that knights, for all their armor, remained fragile inside. And so, on the eve of war, they sought silence. Some walked alone through the dark, listening to the wind move through their tents. Some stared at the stars and wondered if their ancestors had done the same. Others knelt in the dirt, pressing their forehead to the earth as if to feel the pulse of the world one last time. To steady the mind, many turned to rituals. The medieval world was thick with them, tiny gestures of order meant to hold chaos at bay. A knight might circle his sword 3 times before sheathing it. He might enter the battlefield only with his right foot first. He might whisper the same line of scripture before every charge. None of it had power beyond belief, but belief itself was powerful. One chronicler wrote that a knight of Anjou would not mount his horse until he had drawn the sign of the cross upon its brow. Another swore never to strike first, only to answer blows in the name of justice. Such rituals were both superstition and self-control, a way of transforming fear into focus. Discipline was the third pillar of mental preparation. Knights trained not only to fight, but to obey. They memorized the hierarchy of command, lords above captains, captains above squires, banners above all. In battle, chaos could only be defeated by structure. Each signal, each sound had meaning. A trumpet might call a flank to advance. A drum might order withdrawal. A banner's tilt could decide where 100 men turned their horses. To master fear, one had to trust the system, the chain of command, the rhythm of orders, the certainty that someone knew what must be done. So they practiced it endlessly. By the time war came, obedience itself was comfort. When the horns sounded, they did not think, they moved. When the banner waved, they charged. And in that surrender to discipline, they found strange peace. Older knights carried lessons from long campaigns. They knew fear could not be killed, only quieted. One such veteran might sit with his men the night before battle and tell them stories, not of victory, but of survival. He might speak of the Battle of Poitiers, where arrows fell like rain and men drowned in their own armor. He might tell them how in that storm of death he remembered his mother's song and kept fighting, because to stop would mean never hearing it again. Such tales bound men together more tightly than oaths. They reminded each other that fear was shared, that courage was collective. The code of chivalry also shaped the knight's mind. Honor, loyalty, mercy, courage. These were not just ideals, they were armor for the soul. Before dawn, many knights knelt to reaffirm their vows, to protect the weak, to speak truth, to fight with honor, to die with faith. Even if the world around them broke every rule, they clung to these promises. It gave meaning to what otherwise might have been slaughter without sense. Chivalry could not stop fear, but it gave it purpose. In the hours before battle, as the first light crept over the horizon, there was often a strange quiet. Men checked their armor, adjusted their belts, whispered final words. Some looked toward the enemy lines, distant shadows moving through morning mist. They felt their hearts hammering, the weight of steel pressing into their shoulders. They thought of home. A few smiled, not from joy, but from the sharp, thrilling clarity that comes when there is no more time to doubt. When the horns sounded, every knight felt the old fear rise, that cold flood that no amount of prayer or practice could erase.
But they also felt something else: unity. They looked left and right and saw brothers, comrades, men bound by the same oath. And in that instant, the fear became bearable. The lance lowered, the horse moved. The mind, trained by years of discipline and faith, became still. The knight ceased to think. He simply was. A force of purpose and belief, moving forward through the roar of war. That was the heart of a knight's preparation. Not only armor and weapon, but the conquest of the self. Because long before they charged into battle, knights had already fought their first and greatest war, the silent one within their own hearts. The camp before dawn, brotherhood, songs, and the last hours of peace. The sky was still dark when the camp stirred for the final time. A thin line of silver bled across the horizon, not yet sunrise, but a promise of it. The air was heavy with dew, and the fires had burned down to quiet embers. Soon the horns would sound. Soon the banners would rise. But for now, time seemed suspended. A fragile space between sleep and death, between yesterday and eternity. The knights gathered in small circles around the dying fires. Some spoke in low voices, others simply sat in silence, staring into the coals.
The flicker of the flames painted their faces in gold and shadow, faces lined by age, youth, and fear. There was laughter, too, uneasy, fleeting laughter that rose like sparks and vanished. Men joked about home, about wives and taverns, about the feasts they would demand after victory. They spoke loudly, almost too loudly, as if noise itself could drown out the truth waiting just beyond the dawn. Nearby, squires moved quietly, their hands trembling as they packed away bedrolls, tended horses, and checked armor one final time. They were young, many barely 16, yet they carried themselves with the gravity of old men. They had learned that fear could not be erased, only hidden behind busy hands. A boy named Etienne, thin, pale, his hair still soft with youth, knelt by his master's horse, whispering softly as he fastened the girth strap. The destrier turned its great head, eyes calm, breath steaming in the chill. Etienne's lips moved in prayer, not for victory, just that his master might live. He had followed Sir Renaud since he was 12. If the night fell, Etienne would have to survive alone, a squire without a lord. And so, like many that morning, he prayed not to God of war, but to God of mercy.
The knights themselves spoke of brotherhood. It was one of the few comforts they had left. They clasped forearms, shared quiet vows. If I fall, tell my son how I stood. If I live, I will drink in your name. There were no grand speeches, only small promises woven from loyalty and fear. For in battle, a man's courage was not drawn from oaths or banners, but from those who stood beside him. The knight trusted his brothers more than his prayers. He trusted the familiar voice that would shout his name in the melee, the shield that would guard his flank, the hand that would lift him up if he fell. This was the true heart of chivalry, not romance, but reliance. In the distance, priests moved among the tents, their robes brushing against the grass, candles flickering in the wind. They murmured blessings in Latin, voices gentle, tired. Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo. A knight knelt, his sword across his knees, as the priest sprinkled holy water over the blade. Droplets clung to the metal like morning dew. It was not just ritual, it was armor for the soul. The priest spoke of courage, of forgiveness, of eternal rest. Some knights listened with bowed heads. Others stared past him, lost in their own thoughts. Faith was both comfort and question, the last and the oldest weapon they carried. Then came the songs. At first, only one voice, low, rough, uncertain. A knight with a scarred face began to hum an old tune, one learned from his mother long ago. It was not a battle hymn, but a lullaby. Slowly, others joined in, their voices weaving through the cool morning air. The song carried across the camp, soft and haunting. Its melody told of home, of rivers, of green fields, of peace. Even the horses grew still, as if listening. In that moment, there was unity not of arms, but of hearts. The song became a thread binding them together,
men of many lands and tongues, joined by the memory of all they stood to lose. And when it ended, no one spoke. The silence that followed was deeper than prayer. Not far from the fires, some knights used these final hours for quiet reflection. They checked their weapons one last time, running fingers over edges sharpened in the dark. They tightened straps on armor that already pinched and bruised. They tested the balance of their swords, the weight of their shields.
The motions were mechanical, practiced, soothing. It was not readiness they sought, but control, something solid to hold against the uncertainty to come. Others tended to their horses, feeding them small handfuls of oats, smoothing manes, murmuring soft promises. Each knight knew his destrier's nature, which foot it favored, how it breathed before a charge, how it responded to fear. In many ways, they understood their horses better than themselves. And in those final hours, they treated them not as beasts of war, but as companions, partners in the last journey. For those of noble birth, the night before battle was also a moment to remember why they fought. Some fought for their king, some for family honor, some for God, others for glory, and some, truthfully, for nothing but survival. There were those who carried tokens, a ribbon from a lover, a ring from a wife, a small cross carved from wood. These talismans hung against their hearts, unseen beneath armor, but felt with every breath. They were reminders that life still existed beyond the battlefield, that the world would go on, even if they did not. Across the camp, a few knights could be seen writing by candlelight. Their words were not grand declarations, but farewells. My dearest Eleanor, if these lines reach you, I pray they bring peace. Tell my son to remember his father was not afraid. If I return, I shall build the chapel I promised. The letters were folded, sealed with wax, and handed to squires with trembling hands. No one asked questions. Each knew the weight of what was being entrusted. As the hour grew late, sleep crept upon the camp like an old patient visitor. Some resisted it, sitting by the embers until their eyes grew heavy. Others lay down upon their cloaks, helmets beside them, swords within reach. The earth was cold and damp, but exhaustion was stronger than comfort. A few whispered prayers as they drifted off. One murmured the name of his wife. Another gripped his sword like a child holding a talisman against nightmares.
And then stillness. The crackle of the fire faded. The wind rustled softly through the banners. A horse snorted, pawing the dirt once, then settled again. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent witnesses to this fragile sleep. Those who slept dreamed uneasily. Some dreamed of home, of sunlight, laughter, the smell of fresh bread. Others dreamed of chaos, the clamor of steel, the cries of dying men. Many awoke with a start, heart pounding, unsure whether they had slept at all. But there was peace, too, the strange, heavy calm that comes when a man has accepted what awaits him. For in that surrender, fear loses its sharpness. The hours passed like whispers. A thin mist crept across the ground, curling around the tents. The candles burned low. And somewhere, deep within the camp, a single voice prayed aloud. Lord, make me steadfast. Let me stand firm in the storm. And if I fall, receive me with mercy. The prayer was soft, but it carried, through the quiet, through the fog, through the hearts of those who listened without meaning to. A few knights opened their eyes, gazing into the darkness. Some crossed themselves, others simply listened. It was enough. Just before dawn, the silence was broken by the faint sound of hooves. Messengers moved through the camp, whispering orders. Captains stirred. Trumpeters prepared their horns. The night, that last fragile night of laughter, fear, and brotherhood, was ending. Soon the light would rise, and with it the world would change. The knights who had sung, who had prayed, who had written their last words, they would become the storm they had spent their lives preparing for. And when history remembered them, it would speak of glory, of banners, of victory and loss. But it would never remember this: the quiet before the dawn, the songs whispered into the wind, and the last warmth of human voices before the steel began to sing.
The eve of blood, the night before battle. As the campfire smoke curled upward into the cold night sky, the knights sat in uneasy silence. The songs had stopped, the laughter had faded. What lingered now was the quiet, heavy presence of anticipation, the knowledge that by this time tomorrow, many of them would no longer draw breath. The men-at-arms murmured prayers. Squires moved quietly through the rows of tents, oiling swords, polishing shields, adjusting straps, and making sure every helmet fit snugly. The knights themselves, though proud, were not immune to fear. They just wore it differently, with calm voices, fixed gazes, and rituals of preparation that gave them something to hold on to before the chaos of dawn. Inside his tent, a knight's world became smaller, a canvas shelter lit by flickering candlelight, his armor glinting like a silent companion. He would kneel before a small cross or relic, his hands clasped in prayer, whispering to God for strength, forgiveness, and courage. "Lord, grant me victory, or a good death," many would say. Outside, the camp was alive in its own way. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the iron tang of sharpened weapons. Horses, restless and sensing the tension of their riders, snorted and stomped the ground. Armor clinked softly as men made final adjustments. A knight would check his sword again and again, even though he knew it was ready. He was really checking himself, testing the steadiness of his hands. Squires, often just boys, were exhausted but determined. They laid out their master's armor piece by piece, from the padded gambeson to the gleaming breastplate. They'd polish until the reflection was clear enough to see the flicker of firelight in it. For some, it was their first campaign, and they'd lie awake, listening to the soft murmurs of prayer and the wind against the tents. Some nights could not sleep. They paced. They talked quietly with their brothers-in-arms about home, about wives and children, or about past battles that had already become legend. Others found solitude in the chapel tent, where priests offered confession and communion to anyone who asked. The line was long. Those who did sleep did so uneasily. Dreams came filled with noise, the clash of steel, the cries of the dying, the trumpet that would soon sound. A few nights, hardened by many wars, slept soundly, their minds calm as stone. "I have done my duty," one veteran might say. "Whatever comes, comes." By midnight, the camp had fallen into an eerie stillness. Fires burned low. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken fears and the scent of oil and leather. Only the soft jingle of a guard's chainmail broke the silence as he paced along the perimeter, watching the darkness for movement. Somewhere, an owl hooted, and a knight stirred in his sleep, gripping his sword as if it might disappear. Before dawn, the priests moved through the rows of tents again, sprinkling holy water, murmuring blessings, touching each warrior's brow with the sign of the cross. Some knights knelt in the dirt, pressing their foreheads to the ground, whispering, "Into thy hands, O Lord." Then came the sound, a horn in the distance, one long note that pierced the quiet and sent a tremor through the camp. The knights rose. They strapped on their armor. The squire's hands shook as he tightened each buckle, each strap. The world became smaller again, the weight of metal, the sound of breath echoing in the helmet, the heartbeat pounding in the chest. The sun began to rise, a pale, cold light over the misty fields. Across the valley, the enemy banners appeared like ghosts in the fog, and every knight knew that this moment between the last prayer and the first charge was what he had trained for his entire life. The eve of battle had ended, the day of fate had begun. The clash of steel, how knights fought and fell in battle. When the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the earth seemed to tremble with the weight of destiny. Mist clung to the ground, shrouding the field like a ghostly curtain. Then, through that haze, the banners began to rise, brilliant flashes of color in the pale morning light, gold lions, crimson crosses, black eagles, each one a symbol of pride, of legacy, of men about to stake their lives on honor. Those who did sleep did so uneasily. Dreams came filled with noise, the clash of steel, the cries of the dying, the trumpet that would soon sound. A few nights, hardened by many wars, slept soundly, their minds calm as stone. "I have done my duty," one veteran might say. "Whatever comes, comes." By midnight, the camp had fallen into an eerie stillness. Fires burned low. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken fears and the scent of oil and leather. Only the soft jingle of a guard's chainmail broke the silence as he paced along the perimeter, watching the darkness for movement. Somewhere, an owl hooted, and a knight stirred in his sleep, gripping his sword as if it might disappear. Before dawn, the priests moved through the rows of tents again, sprinkling holy water, murmuring blessings, touching each warrior's brow with the sign of the cross. Some knights knelt in the dirt, pressing their foreheads to the ground, whispering, "Into thy hands, O Lord." Then came the sound, a horn in the distance, one long note that pierced the quiet and sent a tremor through the camp. The knights rose. They strapped on their armor. The squire's hands shook as he tightened each buckle, each strap. The world became smaller again, the weight of metal, the sound of breath echoing in the helmet, the heartbeat pounding in the chest. The sun began to rise, a pale, cold light over the misty fields.
Across the valley, the enemy banners appeared like ghosts in the fog. And every knight knew that this moment between the last prayer and the first charge was what he had trained for his entire life. The eve of battle had ended. The day of fate had begun. The clash of steel. How knights fought and fell in battle. When the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the earth seemed to tremble with the weight of destiny. Mist clung to the ground, shrouding the field like a ghostly curtain. Then, through that haze, the banners began to rise. Brilliant flashes of color in the pale morning light. Gold lions, crimson crosses, black eagles. Each one a symbol of pride, of legacy, of men about to stake their lives on honor.
Yet some knights held to their vows even in death. Their tales of knights dismounting to fight on foot beside their fallen comrades, refusing to flee. Others carried the body of a wounded brother away from the melee, risking their own lives to save him. And through it all, the sound, the endless, ringing sound of steel on steel, never stopped. When the sun climbed high, the field was a wasteland. The banners that once fluttered proudly now lay torn and trampled. Horses wandered without riders. The smell of blood and smoke filled the air. Crows began to circle. Victory, when it came, was quiet, a strange, hollow thing. The victors knelt among the dead, their hands trembling, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. For knights, battle was not just glory, it was the price of glory. And as the cries of the dying faded into silence, one truth lingered in every survivor's mind. No matter how great the cause, war always demanded too much. When the fires were lit that night, the survivors gathered in silence. No songs, no boasting, just the crackle of flames and the whisper of wind through broken banners. A few knights told stories of the fallen, quiet words meant to give meaning to loss. Sir Aldred held the line, one might say, voice trembling. He took 3 blows to the chest and still stood. He died with his sword in hand. He was a good man, another replied softly. May his soul rest. By midnight, the camp had fallen into a restless quiet. Some men dreamed of home, of wives, children, warm hearths. Others saw only the field again, the endless clang of steel, and the eyes of the men that had killed. When dawn rose again, it revealed not warriors, but ghosts. Hollow-eyed men who had looked into the abyss and returned, changed forever. For the night, the battle was never truly over. The wounds might heal, but the weight of memory, that was a burden no armor could protect against. They had lived through war, but in their hearts, they would carry it always. The Knight's Return. Homecoming, legacy, and the shadow of battle.
The war was done. The banners had been folded. The fields where once knights charged and fell had grown quiet again, save for the wind whispering through the grass. The survivors, those few who had seen the battle to the end, now faced the long road home. But for many knights, the journey back was harder than the fight itself. They rode slowly, their horses weary, their armor dulled by blood and rain. Their bodies bore wounds that stung with every step. The songs of triumph that might have once accompanied a victorious army were gone, replaced by silence and the hollow sound of hoofs on earth.
When a knight returned home, he was often greeted not with fanfare, but with tears. Families rushed to see if he still lived. Mothers clutched sons, wives collapsed in relief or grief. For every man who rode through the gates, there were two who did not. And behind every smiling reunion, there lingered the ghost of absence, the faces that would never return. At the manor, the knight's armor was taken off for the first time in weeks. The squire, or his wife, or his servant would help him unbuckle each plate one by one, revealing the bruises and scars beneath. The sound of metal striking stone as the pieces were laid aside was heavy, the sound of a burden lifted, if only for a while. Then came the quiet. For the first time in months, the knight slept in a bed instead of mud. He heard not the clash of steel, but the soft rustle of wind through the shutters. Yet even in peace, his dreams betrayed him. He would wake in the dark, heart pounding, hand reaching for a sword that wasn't there. The mind of a warrior could not easily forget the rhythm of war. In the days that followed, life resumed its steady course. Fields needed tending, disputes settled, meals shared. The knight walked among his people, older, quieter, changed. He spoke less, drank less, smiled rarely. To his children, he was a figure of awe. To his wife, perhaps a stranger. And yet he was also a symbol. In a world that revered honor and loyalty, knights were the pillars of stability, living reminders that courage and faith still mattered. When the villagers gathered in the great hall to hear tales of the war, they looked at him with admiration. He would nod, offer a few words, and say, "It was God's will." Nothing more. But inside, he carried the weight of every comrade lost, every prayer whispered on the eve of battle, every scream that echoed beneath his helmet. These memories never left him. They simply grew quieter with time, like embers beneath ash. Sometimes, on clear nights, he would walk outside to the edge of his lands and look at the stars. The same stars that had watched over him on countless campaigns. He would think of the men who had fallen, brave knights, laughing squires, nameless foot soldiers, and murmur a prayer for their souls. And when the wind blew through the fields, he almost thought he could hear the sound of hooves again, faint, distant, like ghosts charging forever into the horizon. The knight had returned home, yes, but part of him remained forever on that battlefield. For though he had survived war, war would never fully release him. It lived in his scars, in his silence, in the way his hand still trembled when he saw the sunrise. He had dreamed of glory, fought for honor, prayed for salvation, and in the end learned that even the bravest victory carried the shadow of sorrow. The legacy of the knight, myths, memory, and the end of an era. The age of the knight did not end in a single day or a single battle. It faded, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the last echo of a song drifting through the halls of history. For centuries, knights had been the beating heart of medieval Europe, symbols of honor,
courage, and devotion. They were the embodiment of chivalry, the armored guardians of kings, the champions of faith. But time, as it always does, changed everything. When the wars ended and the world began to shift, the role of the knight changed with it. The rise of new weapons, the longbow, the crossbow, and later, the gunpowder musket, turned armor into a relic. What good was a steel breastplate against lead shot? What chance had a noble charge against cannon fire? The knights, once invincible, found themselves outmatched by the march of progress. Their glorious battles gave way to formations and gunfire, to soldiers fighting in lines rather than duels of valor. The sound of hooves was replaced by the thunder of artillery. Yet even as their place on the battlefield vanished, their spirit endured.
Chroniclers and poets kept their memory alive. Troubadours sang of Sir Roland at Roncesvalles, of the valor of the Templars, of Arthur and his Round Table. Children grew up dreaming not of muskets, but of shining swords and noble steeds. Even kings, centuries later, wrapped themselves in the language of knighthood, calling themselves protectors of honor, defenders of faith. And in truth, not all that the knight stood for was lost. The ideals of courage, loyalty, and service found new forms in soldiers, explorers, and even scholars who fought not with blades, but with conviction. The world changed, but the longing for heroism, for meaning, never disappeared. In monasteries and castles, the old armor was kept as relics, reminders of another time. Rusted mail, broken swords, dented helmets. Each piece told a story. A knight's crest carved into stone might still be seen centuries later, long after his name was forgotten. And yet, perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. For the knight was never meant to be eternal in flesh, only in idea. He was a dream made iron, a vision of what mankind could be, when courage rose above fear, when duty triumphed over self. Even his flaws, his pride, his violence, his faith twisted by war, were part of that human struggle between light and darkness. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, it is not the peasants or the merchants they picture first. It is the knight, sitting astride his horse, banner fluttering, sword gleaming in the sun. It is the symbol of what was once believed possible, that a single man, bound by honor, could change the fate of kingdoms. And though centuries have passed, his image endures, in stories, in films, in dreams whispered by those who still yearn for courage in a world that often forgets it. So the knight, though gone, never truly died. He simply rode beyond the edge of history into legend. His armor may rust, his sword may crumble to dust, but his spirit remains, eternal, unbroken, forever waiting in that golden space between glory and the grave. And in truth, not all that the knight stood for was lost. The ideals of courage, loyalty, and service found new forms in soldiers, explorers, and even scholars who fought not with blades, but with conviction. The world changed, but the longing for heroism, for meaning, never disappeared. In monasteries and castles, the old armor was kept as relics, reminders of another time. Rusted mail, broken swords, dented helmets. Each piece told a story.
A knight's crest carved into stone might still be seen centuries later, long after his name was forgotten. And yet, perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. For the knight was never meant to be eternal in flesh, only in idea. He was a dream made iron, a vision of what mankind could be, when courage rose above fear, when duty triumphed over self. Even his flaws, his pride, his violence, his faith twisted by war, were part of that human struggle between light and darkness. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, it is not the peasants or the merchants they picture first. It is the knight, sitting astride his horse, banner fluttering, sword gleaming in the sun. It is the symbol of what was once believed possible, that a single man, bound by honor, could change the fate of kingdoms. And though centuries have passed, his image endures. In stories, in films, in dreams whispered by those who still yearn for courage in a world that often forgets it. So the knight, though gone, never truly died. He simply rode beyond the edge of history into legend. His armor may rust, his sword may crumble to dust, but his spirit remains, eternal, unbroken, forever waiting in that golden space between glory and the grave.
In the heart of every man who has ever faced fear and moved forward anyway, there lives the spirit of the knight. He is there in the father who defends his family, in the soldier who protects his comrades, in the teacher who shields the innocent from ignorance. The knight's sword has become many things: a pen, a torch, a voice. Yet it still shines with the same purpose: to fight for something greater than oneself. And in the dreams of those who lie awake under starlit skies, wondering what it means to live with honor, the old vision still flickers: a lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against the dawn, riding toward a destiny that is never fully won, but always worth seeking. His armor may be gone, his code may be forgotten by the world he once knew, but the dream of the knight endures. For as long as there are hearts that dare to believe in courage, as long as there are souls that seek justice in a cruel world, the knight will ride again, not across the battlefields of old, but across the landscapes of human spirit. Somewhere, even now, beneath the turning stars, his ghost rides on, proud, silent, unyielding. And if you listen closely, in the hush of night, you might just hear it, the faint rhythm of hooves upon the earth, carrying the eternal dream of the night into forever.